Welcome to this special episode of the Informing Choices Minipod, produced in collaboration with One Day in 2050. Ecofascism, Leviathan or Lifejacket of Humankind is a multi-author book featuring 36 top futurist voices who have come together to explore our climate future beyond purely climate data through the lens of ecofascism. But what is ecofascism? Ecofascism is a political ideology that merges elements of environmentalism with authoritarianism or fascism. It often involves a belief that environmental problems are caused by overpopulation, immigration, industrialization, and that these issues can be addressed through restrictive policies and even violence against marginalized groups. Eco-fascists may advocate for a return to a more natural state, often at the expense of individual freedoms and human rights. The premise for all the stories in the book is this. The year is 2050. Temperatures have risen by over 2 degrees Celsius. Global population has reached 9.8 billion. Pressure on natural systems is at its peak. A new global movement has arisen. A totalitarian system has been enforced based on the minimum climate footprint on every aspect of our society. Today, we welcome Fernando to the podcast to talk about how the book came about and specifically his chapter in the book. Fernando, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Well, and thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
So, ecofascism, leviathan or life jacket of humankind. Talk us through the context, the concept of the book. Why this book? Why was it designed in this way? And why now?
I think it's critical to start talking about these types of issues. I mean, we've been talking about them, but in terms of really putting a face on it, really putting some context to it, we think that framing it in this way gives people an opportunity to really think through the possibilities of ecological disaster, of the possibility of world government, and what these different futures might look like. And obviously, it's an ongoing conversation here in the United States. We're in the middle of a big presidential election where a lot of these topics come up a lot, and they're radically different thoughts on the current status of the environment and the climate and what should be done about it. How topical is it? We just had a pretty horrific hurricane come through the southern part of the United States. I know because I evacuated
Oh,
ahead of it. Thankfully, my house got missed. But yeah, it's pretty devastating, and it continues to be devastating. And so we just expect that that's going to get worse. In terms of eco-fascism, the term itself, it's a bit provocative because you don't really normally think the sides have gotten so entrenched, right?
yeah.
In terms of the eco being more traditionally on the left or progressive side, and fascism being more traditionally considered to be more on the right or the conservative side, and really in terms of the environment, that does feel like that has kind of evolved a bit randomly. It kind of feels like either side could have really picked that topic and landed on it, and it just kind of happened to go this way. And whether there's really social or cultural forces at play, or whether it's economic, depends on how you want to look at it. But in terms of the fascism piece, fascism is traditionally thought of as a more right-wing, more pseudo-ideological
Hmm.
construct. And there's a bit of a false dichotomy, right, between fascism and communism, because those are the last big groups that were fighting in the last big war. But honestly, really, fascism is rallying around any particular ideology or mythology, to the exclusion of all others. So that really felt that it could fit nicely in this context. Certainly, if we look at some of the constructs of fascism and some of the tools of fascism, those could certainly be used to apply to almost anything. we think of again fascism as being the opposite of one or the other. But remember, the Nazis were National Socialists,
Yeah.
so it can become a bit of a mishmash, and so we thought that that would be a good hook.
It's funny, isn't it, how words over time kind of
Yeah,
lose their original meaning. So
yeah,
I think that's really quite interesting. The other thing that I think is really interesting is how we take something like the potential impact of climate change, and through the stories written in the book, we actually start to untangle the connectivity, if you like, between the climate, between the environment, politics, technology. All these things come into play. And quite often, when we think about the future, we tend to think about one piece of it in isolation, the future of the climate and those implications, for example.
right, absolutely. And what we've done is we've given about 40 authors the opportunity to really uh, dig in and give us a snapshot of what any particular aspect of life might look like in 2050 with regard to that. In some cases, we've got stories about climate refugees, and some of those some of those read almost like 70s thrillers, just because you've got some governments and their agents that aren't necessarily acting in the best interest of the people. Some of them read a bit more science fiction, like mine. Some of them are driven around a particular agenda or idea or concept. Don't want to load those terms up too much, such as eliminating meat and meat eating and things like that. So lots of different viewpoints and lots of different concepts that we've been able to piece together.
And I think that kind of rich tapestry is something that really makes the book completely fascinating. So what is it you want readers to do, to consider, or to think about after reading the book? How do you imagine this might change people's minds?
Well, as a futurist, one of the things that I'm always doing is I'm always trying to look at different possible futures, and then probable futures, and then also preferable futures, and have them look at these and see if there's any. First of all, if there's any that interest them, and not necessarily the fascist aspect of them, but maybe some of the imagery or some of the solutions that are brought up might be something to consider. But again, also just kind of get people thinking and really looking at this in the subject in a way that they might not have before. And when there are people that are thinking, well, maybe government should impose this or impose that, then maybe also we're giving you an opportunity to look through that lens as well, and see that, yeah, absolutely, government programs are going to be essential for a lot of this. And right now, for example, going back to hurricane relief, absolutely, government both at the national level and at the local level are critical to assisting in issues like this. But by the same token, government isn't the end all be all solution to everything. So get you thinking about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent, lovely. Well, thanks for that kind of outline of the book. Now, as you said, you've got a chapter in the book as well, and yours might be one of those that we might kind of label slightly towards sci-fi. And you talk in your chapter. Well, the story is around the head of the first Mars colony, writing a press release pleading for assistance for his colonists. So, take us briefly through your chapter, if you will. What story are you telling? This sounds fascinating.
So yeah, I mean, it does feel science fictiony, but also, I live in Florida, and I spent a few years living on the Space Coast, so I would watch SpaceX rockets launch and land. And we've gone from, ooh, there's a launch in 3 months that I want to schedule my visit to go see, to, oh, let's pause the TV and go outside and watch this launch and then go back to what we're doing. And or if it's a big one, maybe drive 45 minutes and go watch the rockets land. So we are really beginning to live in more of a science fiction world, aren't we? We've got Starship launching from Texas, and they're looking at capturing their booster soon, and they're looking to to be able to use reusable rockets to land on the moon as well. And they've stated that their goal is to go to Mars. So whether the timeline is going to fit exactly, it's difficult to say. But the last 10 years have had a surprising acceleration. So who's to say what the next 26 years will bring us? So I kind of took that concept and ran with it a little bit. It's interesting because I wasn't planning on writing about Mars at all. I was originally planning on doing a bit more of a Kiss of the Spider Woman sort of two prisoners in a cell discussing how they wound up landing in that cell. Maybe one was, caught, eating meat, and the other one was caught, burning a pile of leaves or something, something simple like that, and just having a conversation about that. And then Sylvia Gallister, who actually got me involved in this project, she said, "I can't wait to see what you write about space." And I thought, okay, yes. I mean, my two focuses are primarily Latin America and space. And I said, okay, yeah, great. I'll write something about space. What would I write about space? And I thought, well, there's a lot of discussion, and it doesn't bubble up to the top a lot, but there's a lot of discussion about emissions and harm to the environment from space activity, specifically launches, and depending on the types of fuel that you use and things like that. So I thought, well, what happens if there is a world government and at this point we've colonized Mars, and they say, you know what, we really don't feel that launches are appropriate anymore, which is interesting because I just finished reviewing a book for Compass called Ground Control, which is space anthropologist Savannah Mandel's argument for ending human based space exploration because of the cost and things like that. So it's an argument kind of along those lines. So what happens when you decide that we're not going to launch anymore, but maybe you've got several hundred people who are basically a 6-month rocket ride away, and 6 months, during an optimal window. And so my thought was, well, you've got this established colony, and Earth leadership decides that they don't want to allow launching any rockets anymore. So what happens to them, when they're dependent? And I called it Roanoke because that was the name of one of the early British colonies in the U.S. that wound up disappearing. And I thought, well, that felt like an appropriate little nudge, and say, okay, so what happens to this colony if they are left to their own devices? What will happen to them? And obviously they're predicting that things won't go well, because at that point, like all early colonies, they tend to be in heavy need of support from, whether it's the home country or the home planet.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. You've spoken there a bit about how you got to that chapter, how you got to that story, your motivation, if you like. Um, uh, so how do you think readers, or how would you want readers to react to that? To thinking about something that we've become almost accustomed to, as you say, almost daily launches. And it's probably never in the front of people's mind about the environmental impact of that. And oddly enough, I was listening to a science program recently on Radio 4 who were talking particularly about the risk of pollution from rocket launches. And one of the disadvantages compared to, for example, emissions from aeroplanes is that the pollutants are actually all the way up through the atmosphere and not just in the first 30 odd thousand feet of it. So what is it you want? How do you want people to react when they read your chapter?
Well, it's a little bit of education, right? Like you said, you did hear about something on Channel 4 that you don't hear about a lot. There's things like um, uh, jet contrails in the stratosphere that can have long-term effects on the environment because they're so high up. There's a thing called a jellyfish that if when rockets are launched right around sunset or sunrise, and you're launching, and the sun's not up, um, but you go high enough up in the sky, and that part of the sky is still illuminated by the sun, you'll see sometimes these beautiful trails um, created by the rocket, and it looks like a jellyfish. I mean, it looks like this amazing thing that's kind of spreading across the sky, but that's all emissions and combustion. Even if you're burning hydrogen, which burns very cleanly, but most rockets don't burn hydrogen anymore because hydrogen is very fickle. That's why the space shuttle would always have delays. That's why NASA's New Artemis rocket tends to have a lot of delays, because hydrogen is really hard to contain and use. So they wind up burning things like kerosene, which don't burn nearly as cleanly. So I think it's exposing people to some of the negatives. I think it's exposing people to some of the reality. It might be an opportunity to create some pressure to look for cleaner combustibles if we're going to be launching at the rate that we're accelerating our launches to. Brazil is in the process of building a launch facility as well. They're creating infrastructure for an entire space city. Obviously, there are some that already exist aside from Kennedy Space Center here in Florida, and Musk SpaceX has their facility now in Texas. India launches, China launches, the European Space Agency launches from French Guiana for the most part. Even in Britain now they're launching rockets. So we've got lots of launches going on everywhere. So that's really something that we need to consider in terms of long-term effects, because we really don't know what those long-term effects are. Because when you burn something here on the ground, then we have a really good idea of what happens to those contaminants and to those pollutants caused by the combustion. But we really don't know yet exactly what's happening in the upper atmosphere.
Well, Fernando, I think that's completely fascinating, and to use something like the idea of being stranded on Mars as a way to kind of get underneath some of these issues with something that is actually so essential to the way that we live our lives, and yet something that we don't really understand too much about in the context of climate change. So, thank you very much indeed for your time, and I hope everyone really looks forward to reading your chapter.
Thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the other episodes of this series of podcasts on ecofascism. And all our other episodes on the Informing Choices mini pod are also available. Do let your friends and colleagues know all about the podcast, and we'll see you on another episode very soon.